All right, hello everyone. Welcome to week 5, which is strategy number 2. We're going to look at American U.S. grand strategy since 1776. So it's quite ambitious, and I'm going to try to knock this out in less than half an hour, just to get a good overview of the nature of American grand strategy since its inception. Now, what you need to realize is that the United States is constrained by the forces of the international system, meaning, in a structural realist sense, anarchy, other states' survival behavior, and as well as the United States' own need to acquire security through power. So, within that lens, the United States must be able to navigate the international environment, seeking to survive given those specific constraints. Now, the United States, when it was right after independence, had to understand what its national security interests are. And when I say national security interests, what I mean is whatever is necessary for the United States to survive, given threats by other powers. For example, now when I say threats, if right now Ukraine has Russia occupying its territory, that is a threat. In 1776, the United States saw threats from a variety of actors. Specifically, if you look at the Monroe Doctrine, the United States saw the presence of European powers as a threat to its existence. And so they wanted to gain control of the entire Western Hemisphere. Now, that is quite ambitious, seeing that in 1775 it was once a colony. So the United States needed to secure itself. And there's a couple of foreign policy orientations or grand strategies that we need to look at. That would be unilateralism, isolationism, neutrality, and engagement. So when we say unilateralism, the United States goes it alone. So when it was first brought into being, independence, the United States was unilateral, but it was also isolationist. That means that the United States acted within its own accord without allies and preferred not to get involved with the other European powers. This is essential, right? This grand strategy of unilateralism and isolationism was geared toward creating for the United States a more independent outlook. They didn't want to get involved with the wars in Europe because Europe was always in conflict. They were always fighting some war, those Europeans. So George Washington decided that it was better to, quote, steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. So this means that the United States should refrain from building alliances that you couldn't break. So you always leave yourself open to an exit strategy. What he preferred to do was this: entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice. So what that means is the amount of power that would be drained from Europe we should not get involved. But what we can do is trade. We can trade with everyone. And the more you trade, the richer you get. And the richer you get, the more prosperous you'd get. And for the United States at that time, domestic prosperity was number one. You have to realize that the United States was simply an agrarian society. They had no real power to project overseas. So why pretend, or why pretend to be something that you're not, really? So they preferred what became known as manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is this idea to strengthen yourself economically through trade, and before you know it, you'll be entering a period of industrialization, which would lead to more jobs being created, more prosperity, and then eventually, when you have the power, then you can expand outward, which is what we saw by 1900 under President McKinley and then Teddy Roosevelt. You had this outward expansion of the United States. So it takes time to grow and develop, for the United States to grow and develop. And throughout history, after George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe and Madison, and Polk. Polk is the one who really took the United States off, and I think that's why he's one of my favorite presidents. Is that he actually conjured up a war with Mexico, the Mexican-American War, through the Texas Annexation Project, and he basically forced the Mexican government's hand to declare war, and ultimately the United States received what we know today as California and much of the Southwest. So under Polk, the United States expanded significantly and gained security from itself because it got rid or created for itself more security by pushing the Spanish out of, and the Mexicans out of the Pacific Southwest. And I think essentially what he was trying to do is create a more secure United States free from foreign influence. So that continental United States was made more secure. Jefferson did the same thing with the Louisiana Purchase. The French were, the United States, I believe, was locked into, at some point, a quasi-war with France over the debts. The United States didn't want to pay the debts it owed to France, and so there were the French and the Americans basically fought a war called the quasi-war. And by getting the United States continent free of foreign influence was basically the grand strategy of the United States. And they did so unilaterally with the aim of being isolationist. So these are two very important aspects of American grand strategy. Now, as time progressed, the United States began to gain more power and more influence in the world. McKinley and Roosevelt, you had the Spanish-American War, after the main explosion. They fought the Spanish-American War, and that gave the United States some prestige because they developed some sort of global influence. And I think that was the first time really that the United States experienced a global influence to that nature. After World War I, that's when you saw more of an engagement strategy. An engagement simply means we're getting more involved with the world, and Woodrow Wilson did that with the 14 points. So the 14 points was a desire to see a new Europe out of the war-torn countries, of Europe, of the continent, because of World War I. World War I happened, and it was so destructive that people decided that we don't want to see another war like this ever again. So that the League of Nations was created to help tamper or reduce the likelihood of war by creating a forum for state disputes, and by refraining from nationalist competition that we saw during World War I, and using the League of Nations as a forum to solve dispute. That was the name of the game, engagement. So the United States decided to lead that endeavor until Congress decided not to pass the amendment that said the United States would be part of the League of Nations. So the United States never joined the League of Nations, So the Europeans basically tried to arrange that for themselves. However, even though there's a lot of liberal sort of push toward creating a better world to the League of Nations, we had at the same time this drive to keep Germany down. And so, if you look at, there's a great book by the name of E.H. Carr's The 20 Years Crisis. And Carr looks at the simultaneous liberal push toward to create a better world through the League of Nations, but at the same time, you had this realist, or not realist, more of an imperial drive to keep Germany down, to destroy German power in the long run. And so that, coupled with a more isolationist viewpoint of the administrations after, specifically Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, as a president, was quite an isolationist, and he preferred to focus on American business primarily. So he didn't want to get involved with any of the European powers in Europe. So he decided, you know what, we're just going to play it cool here and enjoy those roaring 20s. And the roaring 20s really provided this new hope of change and prosperity. And then, of course, the Great Depression happened in 1929, the fall of exuberance. A lot of investors out there thinking they know everything about how to invest, and really what they're doing is that they were borrowing money to play the stock market, play the stocks. And a lot of people made a lot of money initially, right, through borrowed money. And this irrational exuberance led to people the top selling. And then, of course, you had the collapse, I think it was Black Tuesday. And the economy never recovered. And what was made worse was, instead of decreasing taxes and decreasing the interest rate, what the United States did was the opposite, right? So it actually worsened the Great Depression. There's a lot of competing ideas about what caused the Great Depression, but I think it was irrational exuberance, and of course the fiscal and monetary tightening that followed. But this is not an economics class. But what happened is, when Franklin Roosevelt came in, what he did was focused on the domestic. While the Europeans also did the same. The Europeans actually, under the League of Nations, in many ways demilitarized. So a lot of the UK got rid of a lot of his armed forces, as well as France. And then a guy by the name of Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, and he remilitarized Germany very quickly. And the UK and the French were completely unprepared for what was to come. And ultimately, the United States stood aside, and tried to play neutral in World War I. So they were, again, isolationist, right? They didn't want to get involved in wars in Europe. And then, of course, Pearl Harbor happened, and Franklin Roosevelt really decided that this would be the best way to create peace for the United States was to get involved in the war. So this led to the period we know as engagement, the grand strategy of engagement. And what engagement means is that the United States was going to dominate the playing field in the world and the international system to make sure that everybody sort of behaves themselves. And this led to what Aldrich, I believe, calls the first unipolar moment. The second being after 1990, with the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, the United States engaged in the world in two major ways. One, they created the United Nations. It helped create the United Nations. And the United Nations was supposed to be a remedy for the League of Nations. So the League of Nations, everybody had a veto. And in the UN, only 5 countries were to have a veto power. And those 5 countries today are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China. So these 5 countries basically call the shots. And that's because their interest needs to be represented in the Security Council. If they were not represented, then we might have disorder. We might have global competition. So that the P5, even though it seems unfair that we have the P5 with the veto power, ultimately it's to make sure that Russia and the United States don't get into conflicts with one another, and they have the ability to cooperate on the international stage. I believe, though, at this point in time, I think France and the UK are no longer as powerful as they used to be. So maybe it's time to give the veto power, or maybe they'll never agree to it, obviously, but Brazil and India are far more powerful than these 2 other countries. So it's important to have that power represented in the at the United Nations. But that has nothing to do with today's discussion. It's just something you have to think about. The second way the United States got more engaged with the world was through the Marshall Plan. Now, in 1944, 1943, it seemed pretty clear that the Nazi Germany was going to be defeated. And the United States and the UK realized that the Soviet Union was going to be the next big threat. Communism was a concern, but more importantly, it was the power of the Soviet Union, the power and the influence of the Soviet Union. And the European states, the states of Europe, have a sort of friendly attitude to communism. It's not the communism in the United States, that's like, verboten. But in Europe, it's very different. There's a lot of Marxists over there, and they do what they do. So instead of just giving up, throwing your hands and surrender to the communists, what the United States did was that they engaged with Europe by promoting the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was this great idea where the United States would give loans to the Europeans. And these loans were to help develop Europe so they can reconstruct themselves and ultimately become trading partners. And when you're trading with another country, you will benefit, right? So Europe will benefit from the United States trade, and they will basically, because the Europeans need America more, then ultimately they will always be dependent on the United States, and that's great for the United States. So that's part of the engagement aspect of it. It's always to remain active in international affairs. So it's very different. It's a huge jump from isolationist and unilateralism. And so throughout the Cold War, you had a couple of ideas. One is containment. We already talked about containment last week, but also rollback. So rollback is when you push the communist powers back and you compete with them directly. And this explains the number of proxy wars in the world. And of course, the United States supporting dictators such as Cuba's Batista back in pre-1959. You also had the Baghdad Pact, where countries in the Middle East, Iraq, Pakistan, and so forth, will come together to contain or wall up to make sure that, past that point, the Soviet Union would not get even further engaged. But rollback was a very aggressive way for the United States. And, you should know about the United Fruit Company. So basically, the United Fruit Company, what we know today as Chiquita Banana, they had a lot of wonderful fields in Guatemala, just growing bananas. I think something like 400,000 acres of uncultivated land. to just play with. And in one episode, the company had to surrender some of that uncultivated land to the to the Nicaraguans, because President Guzman, who was more on the left, he wanted to improve the lives of Nicaraguan citizens, so he wanted a bit of land reform, take away some of the land from Chiquita Banana, United Fruit Company, and give it back to the people, like in Batman. So Eisenhower said, we can't have that. We need to overthrow this Guzman guy and ensure that this never happens again in Guatemala. And so the United States basically armed and trained Guatemalan rebels and launched a coup, kicked out the Guzman regime, and Chiquita Banana enjoyed much of its bananas, business as it does today. When you eat bananas, Chiquita bananas, do remember they have a long sordid history, as do many companies. I mean, Hugo Boss. I mean, every company has some skeletons in its closet, like all cultures and like all countries. There are some skeletons in the closet. So this is engagement. Again, it's not as friendly and loving as, say, engagement entails. Like engagement, you think, oh, we're becoming more active. But sometimes that active nature is quite, questionable in terms of American soft power. Soft power is a term, basically, the reputation. So engagement continues. Engagement continues throughout the Cold War, and of course with Clinton, liberal engagement of President Clinton. But by George W. Bush, when he was elected in 2000, he said, we're putting a stop to that. We're putting a stop to liberal engagement, and we're going to return to a unilateral sort of approach. Unilateral and isolationist. That's why he pulled out of the climate accord. I forget what it's called, but there was a climate deal that he pulled out of. And of course, when 9/11 happened, he returned to engagement, although in a very neoconservative way, a neoconservative approach, where countries were going to be overthrown in order to protect the United States. So democratic peace theory plus regime change. So, I mean, basically, if you ever read Fukuyama, or if you ever read any Friedman or Max Boot, which we talked about from last class, it all comes back to neoconservative thinking. Now, when Donald Trump was elected, to many surprise, I think what he tried to do is he tried to create what he called a principled realist approach. So he was more on the lines of protecting American interests without getting involved in the idea of regime change. So while Bush and Obama got more involved in other countries, Trump didn't invade any new countries. So I guess that's a sort of improvement in some way, like not invading other countries. In many ways, I don't think the United States can afford invading any more countries. So I'm very concerned about the Biden administration's promise to defend Taiwan if they were ever invaded by China. Another war would be very costly, especially with China. And many simulations show that the United States might not win a war if there was a two-front war with the United States, between the United States, China, and say Russia, or even Iran. So we're in a very weird spot in American foreign policy. And this is where Chris Lane comes in. Chris Lane comes in and he says, look, it seems that the United States is having some difficulty. And so we need to start to figure out ways to solve our problems without expending too much power. And so that's where the idea of offshore balancing comes in. So offshore balancing is this idea where someone else can do the job. So you kind of encourage, hey, Japan, you're up to bat, right? Instead of doing it yourself, maybe Japan can get involved. Maybe the Philippines can get involved, When it comes to Iran, maybe Saudi Arabia and Israel can take care of Iran, Why should the United States be everywhere at all times? It's expensive, And I don't know if you've ever heard of the the U.S. debt clock. I believe you should all pause the video right now, or when you have some time, just check that out and see how terrible things are. So the United States and the foreign policy establishment is, I don't think they're stuck in the cubby holes of engagement and isolation. So when it comes to U.S. grand strategy, we need fresh thinking, we need new thinking. But I think we all need to go back to that old premise of just defending your interests. So knowing what your interests are in terms of survival and defending them, right? So if your goal is to ensure territorial integrity for the United States, that's an interest, right? Do you want foreign powers on your soil? Probably not. So when China buys up land next to an army base, right? That should make you think, like, what kind of espionage is going on? What kind of espionage? If you look at like the tech that we are so dependent on, a lot of that tech comes from China. So what kind of surveillance software could be in that technology, right? What kind of surveillance? TikTok, seemingly innocuous for the young folk today, right? Going about with their silly trends and challenges, but essentially TikTok, they have surveillance technology where they can keep track of your keystrokes, and so that keystroke, they can keep track of your usernames and your passwords and so forth. So I wonder what kind of vulnerability that could present in the long term, right? So for Lane, he sees that the United States and China are basically going forward into a new era of competition, and there is this drive to seek domination in each other's near abroad. We're seeing China increase its presence in Latin America. We see Russia increase its presence in Latin America, and the United States should be concerned about that, because if you go back to Manifest Destiny and the Monroe Doctrine, you kind of want to know what's happening, right, in your near abroad. But the same thing goes for the United States in Ukraine. The United States needs to recognize the importance of Ukraine to Russia. Because if you don't recognize the importance of Ukraine to Russia, the likelihood of there being a conflict grows, which is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing this conflict between the West and Russia because Ukraine wants to get closer to the United States and the West. The thing is that you never let your weaker partner, your weaker ally, call the shots. As a stronger power, the United States should be able to let people know, or let states know, what goes and what doesn't go. So if you look at Finland and Sweden, I was talking to one of you in this class about this. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO, this expands the likelihood for confrontation with Russia in ways that we really can't understand and fathom. It makes conflict with Russia increasingly likely. And then, of course, if we do stuff in their backyard, they're going to do stuff in our backyard. So remember, and moving on to the Aldrich article, which I think was very helpful for me, as I went the first time I read it, you have to understand the constraining forces, what constrains you and what constrains your enemy. Because what constrains your enemy will create or limit specific behaviors, right? So we need to figure out what kind of strategic culture is there in other countries. So, for example, if we understand, and this is why studying other countries are really important, we have to understand what's important to these countries, to other countries, so that we don't create a problem where there shouldn't be, right? So we have to look at our opponents. We have to respect the opponent, right? You can't just assume that everything's going to be honky-dory in terms of American power. Primacy is another grand strategy. Primacy, I almost forgot this one. Primacy is maintaining a more powerful military. So if you ever look at American military spending and how many, like, just the aircraft carriers that we have, I think the United States has 10 more aircraft carriers than any other country. I think we have more aircraft carriers combined than all the other countries. Although that is changing. I think India has 3 and China is working on number 4. So things are moving, things are changing. But we have to understand, right, that there are certain things that constrain our behavior and their behavior. We have to understand what's important to them, but also what's important to us. So it's not like Strachan from last week. It's not simply as thinking about the next 10 years. It's about thinking about the next 10 years within those specific constraints. So knowing and understanding, of course, like many of you in your summaries say that, yeah, things are going to change in 3 years or 10 years. Of course, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't start thinking about those big questions and creating some sort of direction of where to go, who to balance against, and who to ally with. All of these are significant questions that we have to be very aware of. So as you do your readings, as you do these readings for this week, we need to figure out how exactly how our belief systems, the way that we perceive insecurity and the way that others perceive insecurity, how all of that impacts international outcomes. So we're moving past this idea of rational actor. We're moving past the cultural models, and we're taking on a more eclectic approach, a more comprehensive approach. We're paying very close attention to not only strategy, but raison d'etre, like what is our existence all about? And in order to preserve a specific way of life, we're going to have to understand our limitations, and our limitations compared to other countries or states. Until next time.